Prince Harry's second-row seat at the Platinum Jubilee service exposed his new status, because although he remained sixth in line to the throne, one cathedral aisle now separated him from the royals who represented the crown. If this account has been useful, subscribing costs nothing, and more measured royal stories are queued. The bell notification means you will see them. On the 3rd of June, 2022, Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, entered St. Paul's Cathedral through the Great West Door. It was their first joint appearance at a major royal service since leaving full-time duties. Cathedral officials guided them down the nave, past rows of invited guests, and towards places on the far side of the central aisle. The future King Charles III, then Prince of Wales, and Prince William were positioned with the leading working members of the royal family. Harry and Meghan were conducted elsewhere. Their walk ended in the second row, across the cathedral from the relatives who carried out duties for Queen Elizabeth II. Look at the wide photograph before assigning a motive to it. Which matters more here, Harry's bloodline or the job he no longer performs? The camera gave the arrangement a clarity that the printed order of service could not. Pale stone columns rose above the congregation. The front rows faced the altar beneath the cathedral dome. Between the two royal groups ran a strip of open floor, broad enough to register instantly in a single frame. Harry's position was not hidden behind a screen or lost in a private chapel. It appeared in a nationally photographed service marking the Queen's 70 years on the throne. Anyone looking at the full interior could locate him, then locate the senior working royals without reading a line of palace guidance. That visibility mattered because Harry's hereditary standing had not disappeared. He was still the younger son of the Prince of Wales and a grandson of the sovereign. His place in the line of succession remained protected by birth and law rather than by the daily work he performed. He had not become an ordinary guest simply by moving abroad. He remained the Duke of Sussex, and the word Prince still stood before his name. Yet the cathedral plan appeared to use a different measure. It placed public service to the crown above proximity on the family tree. A seating plan at an event like this does more than prevent confusion over chairs. It creates an image of the institution. The people nearest the principal positions are visible before a word is spoken. Couples arrive, take their places, and become part of a carefully ordered picture. Rank can influence that order, but so can function, occasion, and practical planning. At St. Paul's Cathedral, those considerations met in one unforgiving space. The central aisle made every difference in placement easy to see. It was tempting to read that distance as a private message from grandmother to grandson. The available facts did not establish such a motive. No public evidence showed that Queen Elizabeth II had personally selected Harry's chair to embarrass him. Palace arrangements for a service involved protocol, logistics, and the roles of those attending. A photograph could document where someone sat. It could not, by itself, reveal every conversation that produced the plan. Still, the picture carried institutional meaning, even without evidence of personal hostility. Royal ceremonies rely on position, because position saves the palace from explaining itself aloud. A place near the front can signal responsibility. A place among other relatives can acknowledge family membership without granting an active public role. Harry's chair, therefore, raised a narrower and more useful question than whether somebody wished to insult him. What set of rules was being applied to a prince whose title and working life had moved in different directions? The answer began 2.5 years earlier. In January 2020, Harry and Meghan announced that they intended to step back as senior members of the royal family. Their statement described a different kind of arrangement. They hoped to become financially independent while continuing to support Queen Elizabeth II. They also intended to divide their time between the United Kingdom and North America. The proposal tried to preserve a formal connection to royal work while giving the couple greater control over their private and professional lives. That was the compromise they sought. It did not survive the settlement that followed. The announcement required the palace to decide whether a person could stand partly inside the working monarchy and partly outside it. Royal duty was not simply a collection of engagements that could be accepted when convenient. It involved representing the sovereign under an established structure, using palace staff, appearing at state and public occasions, and operating within rules that applied to the institution. Harry and Meghan wanted a new position between two familiar categories. The discussions instead produced a cleaner division. Senior members of the royal family met at Sandringham, the Queen's Norfolk estate, to consider the couple's future. The outcome preserved important family and hereditary elements. Harry and Meghan retained the titles Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Harry also kept his position in the succession. Those facts confirmed that stepping away from official duties did not remove him from the dynasty. Birth, marriage, and constitutional order remained intact. The working arrangement changed far more sharply. Harry and Meghan ceased to be working members of the royal family. They would no longer represent Queen Elizabeth II through the regular program expected of those acting on her behalf. The hybrid role outlined in their original announcement was therefore unavailable. They had sought room to reshape royal service. Sandringham established that formal service came with boundaries the palace was not prepared to divide in that way. The difference was easy to blur in ordinary conversation. Newspapers could describe Harry as royal because he remained a prince. Viewers could describe him as outside the monarchy because he no longer carried out its work. Both statements pointed towards part of the truth, but they referred to separate things. One concerned identity and family rank. The other concerned an official job. A cathedral planner could not treat those categories as interchangeable because every chair had to place the guest within the public order of the day. There was another detail that was often reported too loosely. Harry and Meghan agreed not to use their His Royal Highness and Her Royal Highness styles publicly after stepping back. The letters HRH were not presented as though someone had reached for an eraser and removed their family connection. The practical consequence was restraint in public use. Their Sussex titles remained, while the styles associated with their former working position would no longer be used as before. That distinction matters because royal language often makes status look simpler than it is. A title may continue while the role attached to public appearances changes. A place in the succession may remain fixed, while access to the front rank of an official ceremony does not. The Sandringham terms separated those strands. They allowed Harry to remain recognizably royal without continuing as one of the people deployed to represent the sovereign. If the distinction sounds technical, keep it in view, because that technical distinction determined the most visible image of Harry's return. The agreement moved from paper to daily life quickly. Harry and Meghan established their home in California. That choice placed an ocean between them and the regular machinery of palace engagements. Their public work developed outside the system that organised royal tours, investitures, and appearances in the Queen's name. When they returned to Britain, they did so with famous titles, but without the old institutional position that had once shaped their schedules and their place at official events. Public attention grew more intense after the Oprah Winfrey interview. Harry and Meghan spoke about their experience inside the royal family, and the interview became a major point of reference on both sides of the Atlantic. It changed the atmosphere around later appearances. A doorway, a greeting, or a few feet between chairs could now be examined for evidence of reconciliation or rejection. Routine palace choreography acquired a second life in headlines, often before the underlying protocol had been established. Disputes over Harry's security added another layer. Security determines movement in the most literal sense. Where a person can go, under what arrangements, and with what protection. The issue, therefore, followed discussions about any return to the United Kingdom. It also reinforced the fact that Harry's old position could not simply be switched back on for a family visit. His relationship to the palace now involved separate questions of duty, access, and personal safety. By the time of the Platinum Jubilee, every public encounter carried more weight than it could reasonably bear. A glance might be treated as a verdict. An arrival time could be interpreted as a ranking. A chair could be labelled either punishment or proof of continued importance. The useful approach was colder. Start with what the service physically showed, then compare it with the formal change made at Sandringham. That method does not remove tension from the image. It explains why the tension existed. The Jubilee itself combined two kinds of occasion. It was a national celebration of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, built around her constitutional and public service. It was also a gathering of her extended family. Those circles overlapped, but they were not identical. Some relatives attended because they belonged to the House of Windsor. Others occupied leading positions because they continued to undertake engagements for the sovereign. Harry belonged firmly to the first circle after January 2020. Whether the service would visually acknowledge his former place in the second remained uncertain. His family rank offered a strong claim to prominence. He was the sovereign's grandson and the son of the next king. For years he had appeared alongside the central working group at major royal occasions. Viewers had learned that visual order through repeated balcony appearances, services, and public engagements. A move away from that familiar cluster would therefore look significant even to someone who knew nothing about the wording of the Sandringham Agreement. His official function pointed the other way. He no longer maintained the full-time programme carried out by the relatives acting for the Queen. He did not return for the Jubilee as a temporary working royal. Nor did the celebration cancel the arrangement reached after his departure. The palace had to accommodate the grandson of the sovereign without presenting him as one of her active representatives. That was a practical problem, but any solution would also become a public statement once the cameras found it. The choice of St. Paul's Cathedral sharpened the problem. A cathedral congregation cannot be arranged with the flexibility of a private lunch at Windsor. Guests must be directed to fixed rows. The central route must remain usable. The people taking part appear within the same broad field of view. Once everyone is seated, their positions form a map. The map does not explain itself, yet viewers can see who has been grouped together and who has been given the leading places. This is why the scene at the Great West Door mattered before Harry reached his chair. He entered with a status the public already knew: Prince, Duke, and grandson of the Queen. Each step down the nave brought him towards a decision made by organisers before his arrival. He could not carry both versions of his position into the same seat. The plan would have to give visible priority either to inherited rank or to present responsibility. The second row supplied the first clue, but it did not yet provide the complete answer. Its meaning depended on the people around him. If Harry had been grouped according to closeness to the throne, the arrangement would point towards dynasty. If those nearby shared his lack of full-time duties, it would point towards function. Names, rather than outrage, would settle that part of the argument. The question was no longer whether Harry belonged to the family. It was where the crown would place a relative who no longer acted in its name. That was the unresolved test when Harry entered St. Paul's as both the Queen's grandson and a non-working royal. Would the seating plan follow his blood rank or his official function? The answer appeared in the names printed around Harry and Meghan. Princess Eugenie and Jack Brooksbank sat beside them. Princess Beatrice and Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi were nearby in the same cathedral section. All four belonged unmistakably to Queen Elizabeth II's family, yet none was there as a full-time representative of the sovereign. Ignore the headlines for a moment and look at the people beside Harry. The palace category becomes much easier to see. That company mattered because a royal seating plan rarely needed a written label. No card had to identify a guest as working or non-working. The grouping did it. Place several close relatives together in the second row, and their shared position becomes visible before anyone explains the protocol. Harry's chair acquired meaning from the chairs around it. The arrangement did not reduce the standing of Princess Eugenie or Princess Beatrice within the family. They remained the Queen's granddaughters. Their husbands attended as members of that extended family circle. They took part in an occasion marking the sovereign's 70-year reign, and their presence carried genuine personal significance. Institutional duty, however, was a separate measure. A full-time working royal appeared on behalf of the monarch as part of an official role. That work could shape where the person stood, when the person arrived, and which group received the most prominent position at a state or ceremonial occasion. Family affection could not be plotted on a cathedral floor. Public function could. That is why the second row should not be read as a simple scale of human importance. It was closer to an organisational map. The people beside Harry were close enough to the sovereign to belong at a major family occasion, but their ordinary place within the monarchy did not involve carrying out a full programme of duties in her name. Harry now shared that institutional feature. His birth had not changed. His relationship to his grandmother had not been revoked. But after leaving royal duties, he no longer arrived as one of the people assigned to represent the crown through regular public work. At St. Paul's, the distinction became physical. A seat turned an administrative change into something a camera could record. Across the central aisle, the leading positions told the other half of the story. The then Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall sat among the senior working royals. So did the Duke of Cambridge and the Duchess of Cambridge. Their places reflected the functions they were performing within the monarchy at that time, as well as their place in the wider royal structure. The contrast was especially sharp because the people involved were so closely connected. The then Prince of Wales was Harry's father. The Duke of Cambridge was his brother. A few yards of cathedral floor separated men whose family relationships could hardly have been closer. Yet the plan was not arranged as a private family lunch. It presented an institution during a national service. That difference explains why a wide photograph could appear harsher than the underlying rule. A single frame flattened every consideration into distance. It showed one branch of the family on one side and Harry with non-working relatives on the other. It could not show the meetings, practical limits, or decisions that had produced the plan. Still, the picture contained a real fact. The working royals occupied the leading group. Harry did not. Any fair account has to preserve that fact without leaping from visible separation to a private motive that the image cannot prove. Protocol can send a clear message even when no one intended the message as punishment. The grouping also showed why hereditary rank alone could not explain the chairs. If the order had followed only the line of succession, Harry's position would have looked different. But St. Paul's was hosting a service during the Platinum Jubilee, and the monarchy was presenting those who acted for the sovereign alongside relatives who attended without that full-time role. The choice was therefore broader than one man. Harry's placement made sense within the category formed by Eugenie, Beatrice, and their husbands. Remove the surrounding guests from view, and his chair might look arbitrary. Put them back into the frame, and a consistent institutional logic begins to appear. There was another part of that logic outside the cathedral. Position was communicated through movement as well as chairs. The royal arrivals at the Great West Door were staggered according to role. Different groups reached St. Paul's at different points, allowing the occasion to receive them in an order that matched the structure later visible inside. A staggered arrival did more than keep a timetable moving. It prevented every member of the family from collecting in one doorway at once. That mattered on an occasion followed by photographers, broadcasters, and crowds. A pause, a glance, or a missed greeting could become the day's dominant image before the service had even begun. For Harry and Meghan, the risk was unusually obvious. Their return was already being examined through everything that had followed their withdrawal from royal duties. If they had met the senior working royals unexpectedly in the entrance, the central question of the Jubilee service might have been displaced by a few seconds of body language. The schedule reduced that possibility. Each royal group could enter, be received, and move toward its assigned place without requiring a public family encounter in the central aisle. The arrangement was controlled, but control is part of what ceremonial planning is meant to provide. St. Paul's had a congregation to seat and a service to conduct, not a family dispute to stage for the cameras. Ask what this planning achieved before asking whom it offended. It organized public roles and kept a charged family encounter out of the aisle. That does not make the emotional history disappear. It does show that the arrival order had a practical effect independent of anyone's private feelings. The same caution applies to the people who were missing. Queen Elizabeth II did not attend the service after experiencing discomfort during the previous day's Jubilee events. Her absence carried particular weight because the entire occasion marked her reign, but the stated reason concerned her physical comfort. It did not supply evidence about her view of Harry's chair. Her non-attendance also changed the visual centre of the service. The sovereign being honoured was not seated beneath the dome. The leading working royals, therefore, bore more of the public focus inside St. Paul's. Their prominent positions were part of the monarchy's functioning response to an event the Queen herself could not attend. Prince Andrew was absent for a different documented reason. He had tested positive for COVID-19. That fact removed another prominent member of the family from the cathedral, and altered the gathering viewers saw. It did not by itself reveal anything further about the logic used to place Harry and Meghan. Both absences matter because empty space invites stories. When a major royal is not present, observers often try to connect the absence to the most controversial figure who is present. Here, the public explanations were available. The Queen had experienced discomfort. Andrew had received a positive test. Going beyond those explanations would require evidence the service itself did not provide. By then, however, the seating plan had already produced a harsher interpretation. The second row was conspicuous. The aisle was easy to see. Harry and Meghan's earlier conflicts with the institution meant that many viewers approached the image expecting a rebuke. In that atmosphere, a protocol decision could quickly be described as a calculated snub. The claim had an intuitive appeal. A prince who had once appeared with the central working group returned and found himself seated away from his father and brother. Photographs offered a neat before and after story, even when the full rules behind either image were not visible. Personal humiliation made a stronger headline than institutional classification. The Sussexes' presence intensified that reading because every public detail carried recent history. Their departure from royal duties had not been treated as a minor change of address. It had produced arguments about service, public funding, security, titles, and the limits of a part-time royal role. By the Jubilee, even a doorway could be interpreted as a verdict. But interpretation still has to meet evidence. A conspicuous result does not prove a personal order. The photograph supports a change of status, but does it support the claim that the Queen personally ordered a humiliation? The public record does not go that far. No public evidence showed Queen Elizabeth II drawing up the plan to embarrass her grandson. No documented instruction established that she selected his row as a punishment. Without such evidence, the personal snubbing claim remains an interpretation of the outcome, not a demonstrated account of how the decision was made. That limit is important because a large service at St. Paul's involved more than a private royal preference. Cathedral logistics helped determine where groups could be seated and how they could move through the building. Precedents shaped the formal order. Palace planning linked those demands to the roles held by the guests. None of those factors is mysterious. A cathedral has fixed entrances, rows, aisles, and sightlines. A royal household has categories of attendance and an established order for ceremonial occasions. When the two systems meet, individual chairs become part of a much larger plan. The result may feel personal to the people inside it, but feeling personal is not proof that personal injury was its purpose. Precedence also requires care because it is not always one simple list. Hereditary standing answers one question. Official representation answers another. The Jubilee service placed particular emphasis on the people carrying out duties for the sovereign. That helps explain why the working group occupied the leading positions even though Harry retained a significant place in the royal family. Palace planning added the public setting. Harry and Meghan could not enter St. Paul's as though the previous 2 years had produced no change. They had ceased to serve as working royals. Seating them within that group would have suggested an official role they no longer held. Placing them with close, non-working relatives made the changed arrangement legible without removing them from the family occasion. That is the narrower conclusion supported by the available facts. The placement marked a boundary of function. It did not establish that the Queen wished to humiliate Harry, and it did not prove that every practical choice was free of personal feeling. It simply gives no reliable basis for declaring private intent. This restraint does not weaken what happened inside St. Paul's. In one sense, it makes the scene more revealing. A deliberate insult would have told us something about a single relationship. A consistent division by role tells us something larger about how the monarchy protects its public structure when family members change their place within it. Harry remained the Queen's grandson as he took his seat. The people around him confirmed that family belonging had been preserved. He had not been placed among unrelated guests or treated as someone outside the royal house. He attended with relatives whose connection to the sovereign was beyond question. His hereditary standing also remained intact. A cathedral seating plan could not rewrite the family tree or erase his rank. The chair had a narrower reach. It showed how the institution classified him for that occasion, after his active service on behalf of the sovereign had ended. That is why the word snub can obscure as much as it reveals. It turns a structural decision into a private quarrel and asks the viewer to guess at motive. The documented arrangement points instead to a distinction the monarchy had to make in public. Being born into the dynasty was not the same as acting for the crown. The company around Harry supplied one side of that distinction. The working royals across the aisle supplied the other. Between them lay a strip of cathedral floor that looked almost incidental until the names and roles were considered together. Then it became the most important feature in the frame. Once personal humiliation was separated from documented protocol, one concrete image still demanded an explanation. What two systems did the central aisle place on opposite sides? They were hereditary succession and active service to the sovereign. The first followed Prince Harry through birth. The second followed the duties he performed on Queen Elizabeth II's behalf. Those systems had once placed him in roughly the same direction. By the Platinum Jubilee, they pointed to opposite sides of St. Paul's Cathedral. Hereditary succession begins with the family line. It does not depend on how many engagements a royal completes, where that person lives, or whether the palace includes that person in an official visit. Harry was born the younger son of the future King Charles III. Stepping back from royal duties did not rewrite that parentage. The Sandringham settlement changed his working relationship with the monarchy. It did not stop him from being a prince. It did not remove his Sussex title or erase his place in the family line. He remained the Duke of Sussex, and his position in the order of succession continued to follow the rules governing birth and descent. That distinction matters because the word status can hide several different questions. One question asks where Harry stood in the royal family. Another asks whether he acted for the sovereign. A third asks how the institution should display him at a public service. The answer could change from one question to the next, without any document contradicting another. A place in the succession answers a narrow constitutional question. It identifies who follows whom in the hereditary line to the throne. It is not a weekly duty list from Buckingham Palace. It does not show who opened a hospital, received an ambassador, attended a reception, or represented Queen Elizabeth II at an event. Harry's family rank therefore survived the decision made in 2020. His life in California could alter his public role, but distance from London did not make him a stranger to the dynasty. The family tree still placed him close to the sovereign, even after the working structure of the palace had moved on without him. The second system worked differently. At a ceremony such as the service at St. Paul's Cathedral, public position could reflect current responsibility. Those who regularly carried out duties for the sovereign were the working royals. Their places showed the institution functioning in the present, rather than the family line unfolding across generations. That was why the leading positions contained the people then performing the leading roles. The future King Charles III, at that point the Prince of Wales, sat with the Duchess of Cornwall. Prince William, then the Duke of Cambridge, sat with the Duchess of Cambridge. Their seats corresponded to the work they undertook within the monarchy. The arrangement was not a published league table of personal affection. It was the practical grammar of a formal service. Arrivals, entrances, rows, and neighbouring guests allowed palace planners to place each person according to the capacity in which that person attended. Inside the cathedral, geography became part of protocol. This is where a royal title can mislead the eye. The word prince suggests proximity to the throne, and in Harry's case, that remained true by descent. Yet a front position at the Jubilee service answered another question. Who currently stood before the public as part of the sovereign's working team? Hold both facts together. Harry had not stopped being royal, but he had stopped doing the work that governed the front of this particular room. The two answers were therefore different, but they were not mutually exclusive. A person could remain close to the crown genealogically while standing outside the working institution that represented it in public. Harry occupied precisely that unusual ground beneath the cathedral dome. A family tree and a ceremonial seating plan measure different things. The family tree records descent. The plan organizes living roles at one event. Harry's name retained its place in the first, while his changed duties altered his position in the second. The distinction sounds technical until it is attached to actual chairs. At St. Paul's Cathedral, a guest did not need to read the Sandringham Agreement to see that Harry's institutional place had shifted. The row, the neighbours, and the central aisle supplied the explanation. His title answered who he was. His seat answered in what capacity he had come. He attended as a grandson of Queen Elizabeth II and as the Duke of Sussex, but no longer as one of the people carrying out a full programme of work in her name. That is why the central aisle mattered. It did not divide royalty from ordinary guests. Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, were plainly part of the royal gathering. Instead, the aisle made visible a narrower boundary between family membership and active service. One side contained the senior figures who represented the crown through regular public duties. Harry's side included relatives whose family connections were clear but whose lives were outside that full-time structure. The cathedral did not erase kinship. It sorted public function. The result resolves the apparent puzzle. Hereditary rank could place Harry high in the family line, while ceremonial planning placed him away from the leading working group. Both positions were accurate because each belonged to a different system. Now return to the photograph that drew the attention. The answer is visible without assigning anyone a private motive. Harry and Meghan sat in the second row among non-working relatives. Princess Eugenie and Jack Brooksbank were beside them. Princess Beatrice and Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi were nearby. Across the central aisle sat the senior working royals in the leading positions. That arrangement exposed Harry's new status with unusual precision. He remained unmistakably royal by birth and title, yet the palace no longer positioned him as an active representative of the sovereign. The service acknowledged the first fact and displayed the second. This was not a removal from the royal family. It was a classification within it. Harry belonged to the dynasty, but he stood outside the working body that appeared on behalf of Queen Elizabeth II. His second-row seat expressed that difference without changing his name, title, or descent. The people around him made the classification legible. Princess Eugenie and Princess Beatrice were granddaughters of the sovereign and familiar members of the family. They did not conduct full-time duties on her behalf. Placing Harry in that group associated him with royal relatives rather than the operational centre of the monarchy. Across the aisle, the contrast was equally clear. The Prince of Wales represented continuity at the highest working level. The Duke of Cambridge carried the next generation of that public structure. Their wives shared those duties and appeared with them in the leading section. No herald entered the nave to announce that Harry's position had changed. No note needed to be placed on his chair. The organisation of the room had already said it. The second row identified his ceremonial level, while the central aisle separated that level from the group acting for the crown. This is what the Jubilee seat actually revealed. Harry's royal identity remained intact, but his institutional function had changed. The settlement reached after his departure had become physical space, one chair among a particular group on a particular side of the cathedral. The wide photograph carried more force than a formal palace statement because it showed both systems at once. A statement would have required careful phrases about rank, duty, and representation. The image reduced those phrases to rows of faces divided by a strip of stone floor. Look first at Harry beneath the vast dome. His presence confirmed that he still belonged at a major family occasion celebrating the sovereign. Then follow the photograph across the nave. The leading working group occupied a separate block, visible in the same frame. The eye did the work almost immediately. It registered who sat nearest Harry. It measured the distance to Prince William. It noticed the aisle. Viewers did not have to master a handbook of precedence before recognizing that the brothers had been assigned different ceremonial roles. A service program could print names and titles, but those words would preserve the older signs of rank: Prince, Duke, Duchess. The seating plan added the missing information. It showed how Buckingham Palace treated those titles after the Sussexes had ceased working for the sovereign. Neighbours mattered as much as rows. A seat beside Princess Eugenie and Jack Brooksbank placed Harry within a visible group. The opposite section then supplied the comparison. Together, those details turned a private planning decision into a public description of the monarchy's structure. Distance mattered too, though it should not be exaggerated into emotion. The photograph did not measure affection between Harry and Prince William. It measured the physical arrangement chosen for a formal royal service. That is a smaller claim, but it rests on evidence the camera actually captured. The image also survived the moment more cleanly than spoken explanations could. A palace phrase can be qualified, interpreted, or pulled from its context. In the final wide photograph, Harry's row, the central aisle, and the senior section remained present together. The viewer could inspect the whole arrangement rather than rely on one adjective. That is why the seating plan became so revealing. It did not merely place Harry farther from one relative, it aligned him with one category of guest and separated him from another. Rows, neighbours, and distance all pointed to the same institutional distinction. The limits of that conclusion are important. The image does not prove that Queen Elizabeth II personally designed the plan to punish her grandson. No public evidence establishes such an instruction. Cathedral logistics, precedents, and palace planning All contributed to an event of this scale. A chair cannot disclose what the Queen felt in private. It cannot settle Harry's relationship with his father, his brother, or his cousins. It cannot reveal what was said away from the cameras. Turning the plan into a complete map of family emotion would ask the photograph to show more than it contains. Nor did the arrangement dissolve the family bond. Harry attended the Platinum Jubilee as a member of the Queen's family. His presence at St. Paul's Cathedral was itself evidence that hereditary belonging and official service had not become the same thing. Protocol offers a public snapshot, not a private diary. It shows how an institution organized a ceremony on a particular morning. That can be significant without becoming proof of revenge. The careful conclusion is stronger because it does not depend on guessing at a hidden conversation inside the palace. What the arrangement documents is how the monarchy classified Harry's public role on that day. He was received as a royal relative outside the group responsible for carrying the sovereign's work. The classification was visible, formal, and limited to the institutional setting before the cameras. That limit also explains why the word snub is inadequate. It suggests a single hostile act and invites speculation about intention. The seating plan showed something more durable, the practical consequence of Harry and Meghan leaving the working structure of the royal family. Their departure had moved beyond press statements and negotiations. At the service, it affected entrances, proximity, and placement. The institution had to decide where the Sussexes fitted within a room organized around active duty, and the answer appeared in the second row. Here, the gap between image and reality becomes sharp. The image familiar to the public was still Prince Harry, son of the future king, grandson of Queen Elizabeth II, Duke of Sussex. Nothing about his face or title announced that the machinery around him now treated his role differently. The reality appeared in the work of planners and ushers. Someone assigned each chair. Guests entered in an order shaped by their roles. The leading figures were brought into the leading section. Harry was guided to a place among non-working relatives. That machinery is rarely dramatic. It operates through lists, doors, timings, and seats. Yet monarchy depends on such details because the institution must turn rank and service into something a crowd can see. At St. Paul's, the distinction became part of the architecture. The familiar prince remained under the same dome as the future king. The official arrangement, nevertheless, treated belonging to the dynasty and serving the monarchy as separate conditions. One came through birth, the other required an active public role. This separation did not make Harry less of a son, brother, or grandson. Those relationships belonged to family life. It did mean that the palace no longer presented him beside the people authorized to act regularly in the sovereign's name. That is the sober reality behind the striking picture. Royal identity is layered. Blood, title, succession, duty, and ceremonial position can overlap, but they do not always move together. Harry's departure pulled those layers apart, and the Jubilee made the separation visible. Before 2020, his princely rank and working role had largely reinforced each other in public. At St. Paul's, the title remained, while the official placement followed the new arrangement. The gap between the man viewers recognized and the role the institution assigned could be seen from one side of the nave to the other. The monarchy did not need to deny Harry's birthright to mark the change. It only had to reserve its leading positions for those still undertaking royal duties. That decision preserved hereditary rank while drawing a firm boundary around active representation. The distinction may appear cold, but it is central to how the Crown operates. A royal family can contain people who do not work for the monarchy. Once Harry left that working body, ceremonial planners had to acknowledge both his continuing importance as a relative and his altered function as a public figure. The St. Paul's plan managed that tension with a seat that was prominent but separate. Harry was not hidden at the back of the cathedral. He was visible among the Queen's relatives, while the institutional line remained clear across the aisle. That balance is more revealing than either extreme. Treating him exactly like a senior working royal would have ignored the settlement governing his departure. Treating him as an unrelated guest would have ignored his place in the family. The chosen row expressed the space between those positions. It also explains why arguments based only on succession miss the point. A high hereditary position did not automatically determine the front of this service. The ceremony reflected present duties as well as inherited identity, and Harry's public duties for the sovereign had ended. Arguments based only on estrangement miss something too. Harry had been invited into a cathedral filled with members of his family for the Queen's historic celebration. The plan acknowledged connection, even as it marked the limits of his official role. The photograph therefore resists a simple tale of victory or rejection. It records an institution dealing with a relative who remained significant but no longer served within its active ranks. That is less explosive than a feud, and far more useful for understanding what changed. What remains is more restrained than a feud, and more lasting than a headline. An institution showing, in public, whom it recognized as acting in its name. Return then to the seated guest holding a Platinum Jubilee service program. Harry's changed status was not printed beside his name. The old royal forms remained on the page, preserving the identity known to the public. The fuller answer sat beyond the program. It was marked by the second row, the central aisle, and the non-working relatives beside him. Across the nave, the working royals occupied the places reserved for those carrying the crown's duties. In the final wide image, beneath the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, Prince Harry remained unmistakably royal. But a row, an aisle, and the people beside him showed that he no longer sat where the crown placed those acting in its name.